In the final, turbulent stretch of the Second World War, when empires trembled and the fate of nations balanced on the edge of uncertainty, the skies over the Pacific held a silence that seemed unbreakable. Japan stood isolated behind thousands of miles of ocean, guarded by geography, distance, and the belief that no enemy fighter could pierce the vastness and reach the heart of the empire itself. For years, Japanese pilots watched foreign bombers pass high overhead, assuming that any fighter escorts would vanish long before the coastline appeared. It was an assurance built on logic, reinforced by strategy, and trusted by those who defended the homeland with dwindling resources and relentless determination. That certainty shattered in a single moment. When the first silver silhouettes of the P-51 Mustang appeared above Tokyo, racing at nearly 444 miles per hour with long-range drop tanks strapped beneath their wings, the balance of the war changed forever. These aircraft did not merely arrive, they materialized as a symbol of technological triumph, industrial might, and a strategic breakthrough no one had foreseen. In that instant, the vast protective void of the Pacific evaporated. The empire was no longer shielded by distance. The skies were no longer safe. For the Japanese pilots who launched to intercept them, the realization came swift and irreversible: an enemy had crossed the impossible. And nothing would ever be the same again. In the summer of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces were engaged in the decisive and costly effort to establish air superiority over occupied Europe, a prerequisite for all subsequent Allied strategic and operational plans. The 8th Air Force, headquartered in England, was expanding its operational strength, refining its doctrine of daylight precision bombing, and absorbing rising losses as German fighter defenses intensified alongside an evolving and formidable anti-aircraft artillery network. Within this context, bomber crews trained, briefed, took off, and disappeared into high altitudes where oxygen masks, formation discipline, and mechanical resilience determined survival. For many, the summer of 1943 represented a threshold between theoretical doctrine and the full, unmitigated reality of modern industrial warfare, conducted at altitude under conditions of extreme cold, persistent danger, and cumulative psychological strain. Records from unit histories, mission reports, maintenance logs, and declassified tactical analyses describe a period defined by rapid operational tempo and the emergence of the massed bomber formation as an instrument of both strategic policy and daily human endurance. The assembly of a large bomber raid required coordination from ground crew preparations before dawn through the consolidation of formations in congested English skies, where navigation, timing, and fuel calculations had to align precisely. Each aircraft embodied the labor of dozens of technical specialists working through the night on engines, turrets, radios, oxygen systems, and bomb racks. Airfields in East Anglia recorded the constant movement of support vehicles, armorers preparing ordnance, weather officers drafting forecasts that grew more consequential as missions penetrated deeper into hostile territory. These stages preceded any takeoff order and were documented in station diaries and squadron records, which testify to the complexity of operations even before aircraft faced enemy defenses. Many veterans later emphasized that the mission began long before flight, defined by accumulated tension, ritual preparation, and the knowledge that success was measured not only by the effects on strategic targets but also by the number of aircraft that returned. In mid-1943, the Luftwaffe adapted to the emerging threat posed by coordinated USAF deep penetration raids. Intelligence summaries and after-action reports from this period show the increased concentration of German fighter units along probable bomber routes, the refinement of radar-directed interception, and the development of tactics designed to break bomber box formations through head-on attacks and massed firepower. At the same time, flak batteries defended critical industrial facilities and transportation hubs, expanding in density and coordination with ground-controlled intercept systems. These developments shaped the daily realities of American bomber crews, who faced the combined threat of mechanical failure, hostile weather patterns typical of the North Sea region, and the organized defensive measures of an experienced opponent. Aircraft vulnerability, especially beyond fighter escort range, became a defining characteristic of strategic operations in this phase of the war. As a bomber group received its operational orders, crews gathered to study maps, meteorological charts, photographs, and intelligence estimates projecting enemy fighter strength, flak concentrations, and expected cloud cover. The summer of 1943 featured several missions extending toward the industrial regions of western Germany, where strategic planners prioritized attacks on aircraft production, ball-bearing factories, synthetic oil installations, shipyards, and rail networks. The accuracy required by daylight bombing imposed strict formation methodology, airspeed control, and height discipline, which in turn exposed aircraft to concentrated fire within predictable corridors. Crew training emphasized coordination under stress, including the maintenance of tight defensive geometries when attacked from multiple vectors. Historical records preserved in mission debriefings, crew statements, and operational analyses indicate that maintaining formation was at times more difficult than engaging the enemy directly. On the ground, preparation extended to fuel calculations that accounted for expected headwinds over continental Europe, boosting pressure on flight engineers to maximize efficiency while ensuring that bombers had reserves for diversion fields if weather deteriorated. Weather posed a constant strategic threat, capable of altering mission parameters, reducing visibility over targets, or scattering formations. Archival meteorological summaries from this period document how rapidly storms could develop over the North Sea, rising through altitude bands that bomber crews needed to cross during assembly and return phases. These systems sometimes forced aircraft to climb through severe turbulence and icing conditions, straining engines and airframes already under maximum operational loads. When the order came, aircraft commenced takeoff sequences according to strict intervals, climbing into overcast layers common to the region. The initial ascent often involved flying blind through clouds, dependent on instruments and formation discipline, with the risk of mid-air collision increased in periods of low visibility. War diaries from air stations, corroborated by accident reports, describe instances in which aircraft were damaged or lost before reaching the enemy coast, illustrating the inherent hazards of large-scale bomber operations. Nevertheless, the system was maintained through continuous refinement, and lessons from early losses informed subsequent operational planning. Once airborne, aircraft assembled into combat wings, then groups, consolidating into a structure designed to maximize defensive firepower through mutual support. Pilots maintained assigned altitudes and spacing while squadron leaders stabilized the formation for the long eastward crossing. Aircrew recollections emphasize the transition from noise and urgency on the ground to the controlled procedures of high-altitude flight, where every crew member relied on oxygen, intercom discipline, and constant vigilance. The crew roles, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and gunners, were interconnected through procedures that defined responsibility during emergencies, attacks, or mechanical failures. Crossing the English coast represented the point of no return for many flights, where aircraft committed to fuel expenditures incompatible with immediate diversion. From this moment onward, the unit became an airborne instrument of national policy, exposed to weather, enemy resistance, and the limits of mechanical reliability. Mission reports frequently recorded aircraft returning early due to engine failure, inoperative turrets, or compromised oxygen systems, all of which rendered long-range penetration impossible. Such returns demonstrated the mechanical complexity of heavy bombers and the constant maintenance challenges documented in ground crew records. The raid continued toward hostile territory, and as the first enemy radar signals registered, crews prepared for anticipated fighter contact. The Luftwaffe responded with coordinated attacks designed to disrupt formation integrity and force stragglers away from protective fire arcs. These engagements, recorded in combat reports and gun camera evidence, exposed crews to intense periods of concentrated violence, often lasting minutes but remembered as prolonged ordeals. The defensive success of formations depended on mutual support. Isolated aircraft suffered heavily, a fact reflected in the disproportionate losses documented in group statistics. Anti-aircraft fire intensified over strategic targets, in patterns detectable weeks in advance due to reconnaissance, yet still capable of inflicting severe losses. Crews observed bursts of black smoke marking flak explosions, coordinating with evasive maneuvers permitted within limited parameters to preserve bombing accuracy. Damage reports show that many aircraft returned with significant structural compromise, including shrapnel penetration of wings, fuselage, fuel lines, and control surfaces. Medical records describe wounds caused by fragmentation, cold exposure, and decompression incidents resulting from battle damage at altitude. The bombardier coordinated with the lead aircraft to release ordnance according to the established protocol, synchronizing release mechanisms across the formation. Documentation from mission analyses stresses the need for precision and discipline despite external pressure from enemy fighters and flak. Once bombs were released, aircraft turned toward the withdrawal route, often under renewed attack. The return flight required the same navigational accuracy as the inbound leg, compounded by fuel depletion, structural damage, and cumulative fatigue. Losses during withdrawal were substantial in this period, reflecting both persistent enemy pressure and the challenges of maintaining formation cohesion under deteriorating conditions. Weather frequently worsened on return routes, and archival meteorology indicates that fast-moving Atlantic systems could overtake formations before they reached the English coast. Storm patterns, including severe turbulence and icing, interfered with radio communication and radar homing. The combination of reduced visibility, structural damage, and fuel scarcity formed a hazardous environment in which air crews made critical decisions with limited information. In several recorded incidents, aircraft were forced to ditch at sea, while others diverted to alternate airfields across Britain. Rescue operations, documented through Air-Sea Rescue Squadron logs and Coastal Command records, illustrate the persistent danger faced even after combat had ceased. Recovery procedures on the ground focused on medical assistance, damage assessment, and rapid turnaround for subsequent missions. Debriefings captured immediate crew recollections, essential for intelligence analysis and operational refinement. These daily routines occurred against the larger strategic backdrop of evolving Allied objectives and the cumulative attrition sustained by bomber groups. Photographs catalogued returning aircraft, some visibly damaged, serving as historical evidence of the conditions encountered. Crew rosters documented absences following losses, marking the human cost of air operations. By mid-1943, bomber groups understood that sustained operations required endurance not only in equipment but also in morale. Psychological assessments conducted informally by flight surgeons and reflected in squadron diaries attest to the mounting strain of repeated missions under high casualty rates. Nevertheless, the strategic objectives remained clear: to weaken the German war economy, degrade industrial output, and diminish the enemy's ability to prosecute the war. These goals guided operations regardless of the personal toll endured by those who executed them. And on a specific morning of that summer, a bomber group tasked with a deep penetration raid assembled, took off, and advanced into a hostile environment that combined enemy resistance with the unpredictable dangers of weather. Archival records characterize the conditions during this period as volatile, with forecasts indicating the likelihood of rapid cloud buildup and the risk of frontal storms over the North Sea. Despite these concerns, the mission proceeded due to strategic imperatives and the expectation that clear conditions would prevail over the target area. Maintenance officers confirmed aircraft readiness, navigators calculated routes, and crews proceeded according to established protocols. As the formation advanced, reports indicate that weather deteriorated sooner than anticipated. Turbulence increased, icing layers rose, and visibility worsened. Meteorological intelligence later concluded that an unstable frontal system converged with colder air at operational altitude, producing severe conditions inconsistent with mission projections. Aircraft encountered increasingly violent turbulence, complicating formation integrity and reducing the effectiveness of defensive coordination. Under these conditions, even minor mechanical issues could escalate into critical failures. At this stage, the bomber group confronted not only the anticipated defenses of the enemy but also a weather system capable of disorganizing formations and exposing aircraft to greater risk. Technical failure and environmental pressure combined, threatening the cohesion essential for mission success. The group continued, driven by training, discipline, and the collective understanding that operational objectives demanded persistence despite mounting obstacles. The storm, composed of both atmospheric turbulence and hostile fire, became an ordeal defined by endurance, sacrifice, and determination in the face of escalating danger. The storm that confronted the group as it crossed the North Sea that summer day existed on two levels, one meteorological and one human. The meteorological front had been imperfectly plotted by available data, a limitation acknowledged in wartime weather summaries which stressed the sparse coverage over water and the difficulty of tracking developing systems at operational altitudes. Crews later recalled, in statements preserved in debriefing reports, how the cloud base rose and thickened more rapidly than forecast as the formation pressed east, forcing them to climb sooner than scheduled and straining engines already loaded with fuel and bombs. Icing began to accumulate along leading edges, on propeller spinners, and around cockpit windows, compromising visibility and performance. Instruments had to be cross-checked constantly because turbulence jolted aircraft into momentary deviations from assigned headings and altitudes. In such conditions, maintaining the tight geometry of a combat box became as demanding as any enemy attack, especially in a sky dense with other bombers trying to hold position by reference to dimming silhouettes in the shifting haze. The human storm was generated by the convergence of German defenses around the projected route. Radar stations detected the formation as it crossed the coastline, and controllers vectored fighter units to intercept corridors identified through experience and analysis of previous raids. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe had refined a system in which day fighters massed for repeated attacks against bomber streams, exploiting the absence or limited range of escort fighters, which at that phase were still unable to accompany heavy bombers all the way to deep German targets. Tactics documented in German and Allied post-war studies describe head-on passes executed at closure speeds that compressed engagement windows to seconds but intensified the psychological impact on bomber crews, who watched lines of enemy aircraft growing in their windscreens before discharging cannon fire and breaking away through or below the formations. As the bombers emerged from heavy overcast into somewhat clearer air closer to the continent, the first formations encountered these interceptors. Gunners rotated turrets through arcs of limited visibility, scanning for incoming threats. The radio discipline demanded by operational orders limited open chatter, so the onset of battle was marked mostly by the increased staccato of machine guns and the appearance of black smudges in the distant sky as stricken aircraft began to trail smoke. Some attacks targeted the leading elements of the group to disrupt bombing accuracy, others focused on the low positions, where aircraft were more vulnerable to climbing attacks from beneath. Combat reports from that period, compiled by intelligence officers immediately after missions, emphasized the disorienting effect of simultaneous frontal and beam attacks, especially when compounded by lingering turbulence that rocked aircraft just as gun crews tried to track fast-moving targets. Despite the pressure, the group held to its route. Navigators, operating by a combination of dead reckoning, radio beacons, and visual fixes where possible through breaks in cloud, adjusted drift estimates to counter crosswinds that threatened to push the formation off the planned track. The weight of responsibility borne by navigators on such missions appears in both Allied documentation and later memoirs. A minor error in course could bring the bombers over flak concentrations stronger than anticipated or throw off timing enough to reduce the intended overlap with other wings. Pilots and co-pilots concentrated on formation integrity, knowing that their relative position to neighboring ships determined not just bombing accuracy but mutual protection. The flight engineer monitored engines, fuel flow, oil pressure, and temperatures, particularly as the aircraft climbed through thin, cold air. Radio operators remained alert for recall codes or route amendments that sometimes originated from higher command when conditions along the planned route changed dramatically. As the formation penetrated deeper into enemy territory, flak began to rise in more organized patterns. The German anti-aircraft network, extensively documented in post-war analyses, deployed batteries of 88 mm and heavier guns along probable bomber approaches to industrial regions, tied to sound locators and radar equipment that improved accuracy, especially when bomber altitudes were approximately known. Aircrew accounts describe how the isolated bursts that marked the early phases of the approach turned into denser clusters as the group neared its target area. Black puffs appeared at and slightly above bomber altitude, indicating that enemy gunners had bracketed the approximate height of the formation. Fragmentation from near misses tore through aluminum skins, hydraulic lines, control cables, and occasionally fuel tanks. In many mission records from mid-1943, returning crews reported moderate to intense flak, accurate for altitude and deflection, a standardized phrase that nonetheless captured the feeling of running into a carefully prepared trap in the sky. The group flew on because doctrine and orders required it, and because each crew understood its role within a larger effort that extended beyond their individual aircraft. In mission summaries compiled at group and wing level, this period of the war was characterized by a deliberate push against key nodes of the German war economy, including aircraft production plants, engine works, ball-bearing factories, and chemical installations. The raid that day formed part of that campaign, its target selected not for symbolic value but for its contribution to the machinery of war. Bombardiers, trained intensively in the use of the Norden bomb sight and in techniques of synchronized release for formation bombing, prepared for the final run. Over the interphone, their voices would normally have directed small adjustments to heading and altitude, though the text of these orders rarely appears in written records because cockpit conversations were not routinely transcribed. What remains instead are formal notes confirming that bomb runs were executed as briefed when circumstances allowed. At the initial point, the navigational landmark used to align the formation for its bombing run, the group shifted to straight and level flight as much as conditions and enemy pressure permitted. This requirement represented one of the cruel paradoxes of daylight bombing. Maximum accuracy demanded steady flight, but steady flight exposed aircraft to the most accurate flak and simplified the task of attacking fighters. On that day, the paradox was intensified by the residual turbulence and broken cloud lingering along the front that the formation had recently penetrated. Lead crews had to reconcile the need for visual aiming with intermittent obscuration of the target, a familiar problem in the European theater where cloud often interfered with ideal bombing conditions. As the bombs were released, a visible lightness passed through the structures of the aircraft. Pilots felt the change in handling as the weight fell away, and contrails from higher formations momentarily shimmered through the altered airflow. Below, patterns of explosions walked across the target area and its surroundings in lines and clusters, depending on how accurately the formation had held together. Aerial photographs taken by specialized aircraft in other missions show how even well-briefed attacks could spread under adverse conditions, with bomb patterns elongated by wind or broken by evasive action. In this case, the results would later be assessed in terms of damage to industrial equipment, roofs, and nearby infrastructure, but for the crews above, the immediate measure of success lay in whether they could now turn for home with their numbers and cohesion still largely intact. The turn-off target, often one of the most dangerous phases of any mission, exposed the bombers to renewed flak from batteries positioned around the target zone and to renewed fighter attacks. German pilots, facing increasingly heavy attrition by this stage of the war, nonetheless pressed home their attacks with determination, aware that inflicting additional losses on withdrawing bombers could force the Americans to reconsider the sustainability of deep penetration daylight raids. Allied sources from this period record mission days when up to a quarter of aircraft dispatched failed to return, statistics that filtered back to operational crews and shaped their understanding of the odds they faced. Some bomber positions fell out of formation due to battle damage, engine failure, or wounded pilots struggling to maintain control in the thin air. These stragglers attracted concentrated attention from fighters, a pattern repeatedly confirmed by surviving gunners and by analysis of lost distributions. For the group engaged in this particular raid, the outward storm of flak and fighters began to merge again with the physical storm now shifting over their withdrawal route. As they retraced their path toward the coastline, cloud thickened anew, and the weather front that forecasters had plotted with incomplete data had shifted, presenting a wall of solid overcast stretching from lower altitudes up into the layers in which the bombers flew. Commanders had to decide between descending into potential icing and turbulence or attempting to climb above the worst of the weather at the cost of fuel reserves and mechanical strain. In many mission debriefs from mid-1943, returning navigators and pilots noted unanticipated cloud thickness and severe conditions over the sea, conditions that disrupted assembly of returning groups and contributed to disorientation, particularly late in the mission when fatigue was most pronounced. The group entered the front. Inside the cloud, visibility dropped to zero. Aircraft flew by instruments alone, trusting altimeters, compasses, and attitude indicators that had to be monitored for signs of failure induced by battle damage or icing. Turbulence jolted wings and fuselages, stressing structures that had already absorbed flak hits and near-miss concussions. In the darkness of the cloud, flashes from St. Elmo's fire played around propeller tips and along antenna wires, a phenomenon widely reported by aircrew and sometimes misidentified in early missions before its nature was understood. Icing began to build again on surfaces despite the operation of de-icing boots and anti-icing systems. Crews listened to the strain of engines and the rattle of loose fragments in fuselage skins. In such conditions, the disciplined formation that had entered enemy airspace inevitably loosened as aircraft climbed or descended slightly in attempts to escape the worst turbulence or adjust to changing icing layers. It was in this convergence of physical and combat stressors that individual decisions became critical. Pilots, many of them in their early 20s but carrying responsibilities described in official correspondence as equivalent to those of much older officers, had to interpret incomplete information and weigh fuel, damage, weather, and crew condition. Some aircraft, losing an engine due to flak damage or mechanical failure, found that the combination of asymmetric thrust and turbulence made continued flight at formation altitude impossible. In such cases, crews sometimes chose to descend to lower altitudes in search of more stable air, knowing that this could increase fuel consumption and reduce radio navigation reliability but might preserve the structural integrity of their aircraft. Others, with pilot or navigator wounded, redistributed tasks among the remaining crew, drawing on cross-training that many units encouraged precisely for such contingencies. Emerging from the weather front into slightly clearer air over the western approaches, surviving aircraft began to reform as best they could. The tactical cohesion of earlier stages gave way to looser associations of damaged planes, their formations defined more by mutual support and shared heading than by pre-briefed geometry. Fuel gauges, now significantly lower, became central to navigation decisions. Some crews realized that their reserves would not be sufficient to reach their home base and began to consider diversion fields scattered across Britain, a reality reflected in the recorded landings of damaged bombers at a variety of airfields along the coast and inland during this phase of the war. Still others, with more serious damage or critically wounded crew members, prepared for the possibility of ditching at sea, a last resort decision taken with full awareness of the limited survival prospects in cold water and the reliance on air-sea rescue units whose presence, while real, could not be guaranteed at the right place and time. For those who made it back to the English coast, the sight of land through gaps in the cloud often coincided with the onset of new challenges: congested airspace as multiple groups returned simultaneously, low fuel states complicating holding patterns, and, on some days, deteriorating local weather. Control towers guided them as best they could, allocating landing priority based on damage reports and fuel conditions as relayed by radio. Landing a B-17 or B-24 with battle damage under crosswind conditions tested pilot skill at a point in the mission when physical and mental fatigue were most acute. Aircraft touched down with tires worn, flaps sometimes inoperative, hydraulic systems damaged, and brakes compromised. Some ran off the end of runways or collapsed landing gear, adding to the tally of losses that did not occur over enemy territory but were nonetheless direct consequences of the day's operations. Once engines were cut and the smell of hot oil and exhaust began to dissipate, the final phases of the mission unfolded according to routines refined over months. Medical personnel met returning aircraft to evacuate wounded crewmen, whose injuries ranged from shrapnel and gunshot wounds to frostbite and hypoxia-related complications. Ground crews hurried forward to assess visible damage, counting holes, inspecting control surfaces, and making initial estimates of repair time. Intelligence officers awaited the crews in briefing rooms, ready to collect immediate impressions before memories faded or were altered by subsequent conversation. These debriefings, preserved in many unit archives, captured essential data on flak locations, fighter tactics, weather anomalies, and bombing results as perceived from the air. Crews drank coffee or stronger beverages, smoked, and tried to articulate the sequence of events that now felt both compressed and fragmented. The tally of missing aircraft emerged gradually. As scheduled return times passed, operations rooms updated status boards with chalk marks and notes, recording which planes had landed, which had diverted, and which remained unaccounted for. Phones rang between stations to confirm unscheduled landings. Coastal Command and Air-Sea Rescue units reported any sightings of ditching aircraft or survivors in life rafts. The absence of certain aircraft from the final roll call left gaps that would later be translated into formal, missing in action, reports, notifications to families, and changes in crew rosters. In squadron diaries, entries for such days often combined clinical operational data with brief, subdued acknowledgments of loss, reflecting a restrained tone that nonetheless conveyed the weight of accumulated casualties. In the days that followed, the story of the mission did not become legend in any immediate, romantic sense. It was recorded instead in repair logs, where the extent of structural damage testified to the ferocity of flak barrages, in ordnance reports detailing the tonnage of bombs released over the target, in intelligence summaries evaluating the effectiveness of fighter escorts where present and recommending adjustments to routes and altitudes, and in the personal recollections of survivors, sometimes written only decades later when veterans felt able to set down their memories in letters, memoirs, or interviews. These testimonies, when compared with official records, reveal a consistent picture of a mission flown at the intersection of strategic necessity and human endurance, through a literal storm whose unpredictability compounded the risks of combat. The broader campaign of which this raid formed a part continued. Strategists debated the sustainability of unescorted or lightly escorted deep penetration raids in the face of mounting losses, a debate that would lead to adjustments in tactics, the introduction of long-range escort fighters, and improvements in bomber defenses. Yet the fact that such missions were flown at all during this difficult transitional period reflected a conviction, shared at multiple levels of command, that sustained pressure on the industrial heart of the Axis war machine was essential, even when the cost to individual groups and crews was grave. That conviction did not belong exclusively to planners, it was lived out by the men who climbed into their aircraft on those summer mornings, fully aware of casualty rates that were no secret within the bomber community. Looking back, the image of a group flying into a storm of fire and steel in the summer of 1943 is less a single dramatic episode than a composite of many documented experiences, each anchored in mission reports, photographs, damage assessments, and human testimony. It represents the reality that for bomber crews, danger did not present itself in isolated moments of cinematic clarity but in sustained exposure to hostile environments, weather, flak, fighters, mechanical stress, that demanded professionalism, discipline, and mutual trust. The courage involved was not an abstract quality but a practiced habit, showing up for each mission, performing assigned tasks under conditions of fear and fatigue, and relying on training and one another when plans collided with the unpredictable dynamics of war. For those who did not return from such missions, the record often consists of a name on a roster, a notation in a log, an official letter sent to a family, and, in some cases, a grave in a foreign cemetery. For those who survived, the memory of flights through storms, both atmospheric and human, remained a reference point for the rest of their lives. Many veterans later spoke not of heroism in the sense of individual exploits, but of an enduring sense of duty fulfilled under circumstances that outsiders could only partially imagine. To listen to those accounts alongside the archival record is to recognize that the story of a bomber group in the summer of 1943 is not a tale of invincibility, nor exclusively of tragedy, but of persistence, continuing to fly, to act, and to bear the weight of history in the confined space of an aircraft buffeted by wind, pierced by shrapnel, and held aloft by the coordinated effort of its crew. When we reconstruct such a mission from surviving documents, we do so at a respectful distance, aware that every generalized statement covers specific lives, specific moments of fear, loss, and relief. The storm of fire and steel into which that group flew was not an abstraction, it was composed of shells, bullets, ice, cloud, and decisions taken in seconds. The fact that any aircraft emerged from it, heavily damaged yet still intact enough to reach home, speaks to the interplay of engineering, training, and what many veterans simply called luck. The fact that others did not return speaks to the inherent limits of human control in war, even when supported by the most detailed planning available at the time. In acknowledging both, we honor the reality they knew, that in the summer skies of 1943, above Europe and the surrounding seas, survival was never guaranteed, but duty demanded that the attempt be made, again and again, until the balance of the war was finally altered.